Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome back to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Christoph, and today I've got an interesting podcast for you guys regarding the Bighorn Backcountry in Alberta. So the Bighorn Backcountry is an area, it's not a park, but it's an area up against the Rocky Mountains, including some of the mountains, where there is specific legislation around it regarding the recreational activities and industrial activities and kind of what you can do. So there's restrictions, and we're going to talk about some of the changes, the proposed changes. Actually, there's been no proposed changes by the government yet, but some of the changes that an organization called CPAWS is proposing and what they want. And they're just a campaign organization. We'll explain more about that when you get into the podcast. But it was really, really good. Really explained kind of what the intent is there, and the intent is pure, right? That they want to allow recreation. They want to allow people to be out there and enjoy and pass on those recreational values and wilderness values onto their children and grandchildren, and make sure those values exist for a long, long time, right? They don't want to try to inhibit activities so much as allow activities, but responsibly. So, I brought on Christopher Smith. He is from CPAWS. He used to be a forester. He has a Bachelor of Science in Forestry, a master's in forest ecology, and some other stuff. And he works for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and he's really knowledgeable about what's going on in the Bighorn Backcountry, and the public land use zones over there, and some of the intent and what they want to do. So it was a really interesting conversation. I learned a lot about it. Even though I know quite a bit, he taught me a lot more that I wasn't aware of. Yeah, really good. I hope you guys like it. I hope you guys learn a lot. It's pretty technical about specifically the Bighorn Backcountry, but also if you're not from Alberta, it's okay. It's still a lot about recreational values and hunting and fishing, and a lot about ATVs, OHVs, off-highway vehicles, and what else do we talk about? Industry, and just what happens when you designate something a park. So explaining the difference there between a provincial park, national park, wilderness areas, public land use zones, that kind of stuff. So we're just trying to describe what they want to do. Really good. Anyways, as for sponsors, we have Greenlink Forestry doing resource inventory analysis in Alberta, as well as we have the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta. They are awesome. I really appreciate their funding. Helps me out a lot. Also, thirdly, we have Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is an apparel company out of Edmonton, Alberta. They create really awesome clothes. They have great hats, toques, t-shirts. They have hoodies now. They're getting water bottles, all kinds of stuff. And yeah, they're trying to create a situation where they can promote conservation and recreation in the wilderness and forestry and environmental values through the sale of their clothing. They want to take 10% of their earnings and put it towards a scholarship for environmental sciences. So that'll be coming in the fall here. Really awesome group. They're trying to get their stuff off the ground, get the word out there. And if you guys want to support something like that, you can go to damagedtimber.com, and at checkout, if you buy anything, you can go type in Your Forest 10, you get 10% off. And that's even if he's got sales on, you get 10% off those sales as well. So really awesome. I think he's got a sale coming up right away here, cause he's got some hoodies in and t-shirts. I think, get some stuff half off or whatever it is. I forget. Oh, I almost forgot. If you are in Alberta and you want to have a say in what's going to happen in the Bighorn Backcountry and the proposed activities going on there, you can go to the Regional Advisory Council, and that is a group of people who have come together involving a bunch of different stakeholders regarding that area, and they are making recommendations. And if you have a say, they're sending out a survey where you can give a long-form answer on your thoughts on their management plan. It requires you to do some reading and to understand the issue, but if you want to do that, if you're interested and you have a claim to that area and you want to have a say in what's going on, then you can answer that survey, and that'll give them a lot of information. They're going through all the surveys and taking them all into consideration. So be sure to do that if you want to. Anyways, thanks a lot. I hope you guys like this episode. Don't be afraid to let me know how you feel about it. I know there's a lot of controversy around that area, and I'm interested to know what people think. So don't be afraid to shoot me an email at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com or Facebook or Instagram, all that good stuff. So, here is Chris and myself. So yeah, thanks for coming in. This is awesome.
No worries.
First of all, let's just get into what like your background is a little bit. How long you've been with CPAWS and yeah.
Yeah, so I've been with CPAWS now or CPAWS Northern Alberta for about a month and a half. They brought me on board to help basically lead their campaign for giving recommendations for the Bighorn backcountry.
And what makes you applicable to that situation?
Right. So this past summer, I was actually a park ranger, conservation officer based out of Rocky Mountain House.
Okay.
So for about 5 months, I was patrolling a little bit in the PLUZs or in the public land use zones.
Yeah.
A lot of it was east of those actual boundaries.
Right.
But I lived with the other rangers who also patrolled in there.
Okay.
So I got to engage with a lot of the people on the land base, a lot of the different user bases, and just get to know the land really well.
Okay. Interesting. So then, and your background is in forestry. You said you have a bachelor's of science in forestry and a master's in forest ecology.
Right. So I have a bachelor's of science in forestry.
Yeah.
From Canada. I have a master's of science in forest ecology from Germany.
Yeah.
And then a master's in environmental management and protected areas from Canada.
Cool. Awesome. Now that we got that out of the way, we understand where you're coming from. Yeah, like I had Tara on, that a while back to talk about caribou. But yeah, we should kind of explain for people listening for the first time what CPAWS is and what the mission is there, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society.
Right.
Yeah.
So CPAWS has been around basically since like 1967, I believe.
Okay.
We're the CPAWS for the Northern Alberta chapter. So we deal with everything generally from about Red Deer north.
Okay.
And then we have CPAWS Southern Alberta that deals with the south of the province.
Yeah.
So we have 13 chapters across Canada. And basically it was formed because there was a recognition that their wilderness and parks weren't getting the essentially attention by management and by industry. Basically, there wasn't enough representation of sort of protection during that time. And there was recognition of that. So a bunch of people got together and were like, hey, we need to start advocating for protecting some of these wilderness areas before they're lost.
Okay. So how did it start up? Who are the people that got together to start CPAWS? I never actually looked that up. Do you know? You've only been there a month and a half, kind of putting you on the spot, but
I don't know offhand.
Okay. I'm sure we can look it up on the website.
Yeah, I know it's on our website. But I believe it started in Ontario and then spread out from there. A lot of it was basically there was groups that were kind of already doing that sort of advocacy, and those groups were all brought under the CPAWS banner over time to basically build that capacity. So to have a unified voice.
Gotcha.
Cool. And like sort of share resources and sort of a pan-Canadian endeavor.
Right. Awesome. Okay, sweet. So now that we got kind of that out of the way, let's talk about, I think, the forest land use zones. So I think we should explain to people, or public land use zones. Sorry, I keep messing that up. They got changed from forest land use to public land use and I messed it up. But so the public land use zones, how they differ from parks and wilderness areas and just the green zone, which is like where forest management generally happens.
Right.
Like cup locks and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So the public land use zones, they're actually established under an entire different piece of legislation.
Okay.
So the Public Lands Act is what a public land use zone is designated under. Whereas for parks, they're all designated under one of two pieces of parks legislation. There's a lot of differences in terms of the baseline of what's allowed and what their actual mandate is.
Oh, okay.
Parks, as a general concept, have a main priority of environmental protection.
Yeah.
And that has to be the overarching goal for anything designated under a park.
So that takes precedence over everything else.
Right. It doesn't mean other things don't happen in them.
Right.
It just means that any other thing that does happen, that has to be the primary concern.
Right.
For public land use zones, it was basically a way to take vacant public land. So public land that didn't have a deposition. So there wasn't an oil and gas well on it. There wasn't a road. There wasn't a forestry tenure on it.
Yeah.
So land that hadn't been designated, basically applying a management scheme to it to allow some form of management of the area. So people aren't just ripping up and down.
Right. It's not the Wild West.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's not to exclude anybody from it. It's just to actually manage it, because if you don't manage something, it can lead to degradation, and then everybody loses.
Yeah, and there's no regulation, and then that's a problem for sure. That
right.
makes sense. So right now in the public land use zone, so there's 5 in the Bighorn.
There's 6 in the Bighorn.
6 in the Bighorn. So there's the Blackstone Wappiabi, the Job Klein, the
Kiska Wilson,
Panther Corner,
and
I have it right here. The other one. One more I'm missing.
Clearwater Ram?
Dormer Sheep.
I
think that's it. Yeah. Anyways, and amongst those, there's varying restrictions and varying activities allowed in them, right? So, is there industry in any of those right now? Like, as far as industry, I mean, is there oil and gas or forest tenure or like mining or anything like that?
Right. So one of the big differences between, again, public land use zones and parks is that public land use zones have no inherent restrictions on industry.
Okay.
Compared to like most parks, usually they don't allow new development.
Right.
But any development that currently exists gets grandfathered in and is allowed to stay for the remainder of their tenure.
Okay.
So for public land use zones, there is no inherent restrictions on industry in the legislation.
Okay.
In the Bighorn right now, so in those 6 public land use zones, there are a number of mining interests, mining claims, oil and gas, and very non-commercial forestry right now.
Non-commercial forestry.
Right. So
what do you mean by that?
R11, so that forestry management unit that encompasses the public land use zones, is right now managed by the Clearwater County.
Right.
So it's managed by the local government.
Oh, okay. Not by the provincial government.
Because
the province usually technically owns the.
They own it, but the management plans are done up by
Clearwater.
Clearwater
I see. Okay.
So they're managing it because there is no
I see.
corporation that has that tenure.
Right. So the community's managing it basically.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
The basically non-commercial forestry is allowed, so a lot of it's fire smart. So around the town of Nordag, which is within the public land use zones, they allow select forestry to reduce fire risk.
Right.
As well as, I believe they allow.
That's okay.
They allow minimal intervention to reduce mountain pine beetle risk to neighboring forest tenure holders.
I see. So it's just management, like in the sense of keeping it going. They're not selling anything. It's just for protection and for pest management, that kind of stuff.
And the main reason for that is because this area has been in various states of management really since the beginning of the 20th century.
Oh, okay.
Initially, a little parts of it were part of Banff National Park. The boundaries changed a bunch, and so that was taken out. It was then part of the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve.
Right.
After that, it became part of. What did it become part of after that? It fell under the policy of the Eastern Slopes in 1977.
Okay.
And then a revised version in 1984.
Okay.
The purpose behind all of these plans recognized that the Bighorn Backcountry, had a lot of intrinsic value, specifically as noted in all these plans for watershed management.
Right.
Because it's the headwaters of the North Saskatchewan. Even people 100 years ago recognized, hey, this is really important. We don't want to damage this.
Yeah. And I think that's a term people get confused by a little bit too, is headwaters. Can you explain what that means real quick?
Right. So the headwaters is basically where the water, so the North Saskatchewan coming through Edmonton, all that water is collected across the land base along the run. The farther along you get, the more water in the river.
Right.
But all that starts somewhere. Every river starts somewhere.
Yeah.
For the North Saskatchewan, it starts at the North Saskatchewan Glacier in, I believe it's Jasper National Park.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But only about 2% of the river's source comes from that glacier.
Oh, okay.
But it's where it starts.
That's where it starts.
So because that part of the Rocky Mountains, there's a lot of hills, a lot of elevation. So when it rains, most of the water, 88% of the water that comes through Edmonton in the North Saskatchewan, basically drains into it in the Bighorn.
Right.
So
it starts off as a bunch of tributaries and eventually turns into the North Saskatchewan.
Right. So if you think about it, if you take a house,
yeah,
and the whole footprint of the roof of a house,
yeah,
is your watershed.
Okay.
And where your drain pipe comes down, that's the river.
Right.
So if you think about all that rain falling on the roof, it all gets collected into a gutter, and then it all drains from that gutter out to a single point.
Yeah.
That's basically what a watershed is.
That's perfect. That's a really good way to put it, actually. Yeah. I think for people who are unfamiliar with the idea of a watershed, like lots of people don't think about that kind of stuff, right? And can't blame them. They got other stuff to worry about.
Yeah.
Not everybody can know everything, right? Okay. So we explained that. And so the forest land use zones, so you said there's no restrictions currently on industry and that kind of stuff. There is some restrictions on recreation.
Yes.
Right. So some of them, so it looks like most of those 6, you're allowed to hunt, fish, hike, and, equestrian use. So horses and stuff.
Yeah.
But there are some restrictions in, I think, 2 of the 6 for ATV use and OHV use.
Right. So a lot of what it comes down to is that there's restrictions that are based in legislation.
Yeah.
And then there's the actual management plan of the area.
Right.
So, and this applies for parks too. Like there's certain things that aren't allowed via legislation, but then when it comes to the specific area, they have certain levers they can pull to allow certain things or not allow other things depending on the conditions in that area.
Yeah. Habitat in that area or specific or very,
Right.
Yeah.
So for public land use zones, industry isn't inherently limited by, legislation, but it can be limited through pulling these levers.
Okay.
But generally it's a harder process.
Okay.
So for recreation, the main thing that was preventing or is basically controlling recreation was this 1984 Eastern Slopes policy.
Right.
Which covered basically the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, not just the Bighorn.
Mm-hmm.
And it recognized certain prime protection areas that were critical to either water quality health or watershed health or important species habitat. Basically, they had very important environmental values.
Yeah.
And they were designated as prime protection.
Okay.
These prime protection areas is basically what the public land use zones were placed on top of.
Okay.
So the areas, the 2 public land use zones where no motorized recreation is allowed are in the historic prime protection area.
Okay. Well, that makes sense then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Personally, I've spent a lot of time in the Blackstone Wappi Abbey. I have family there that outfits. And so I spent a lot of time back there, and it's absolutely gorgeous, beautiful country. Like it's where I go to relax. Like it's so nice, right?
Right.
But also that being said, as much as I love the fact that I don't see anybody when I'm out there, besides a couple other outfitters, right? It's also I wish other people could experience it, right? But I understand why I wouldn't want there to be ATV access in there anyways, because I think there needs to be areas that are protected that way, right? Yeah. However, in some of these areas, like for example, you're allowed in the Job Klein, which is I think it's the biggest public land use zone in the Bighorn right now, right?
Believe so.
Yeah.
Or if not the second biggest, it's one of the 2.
And you're allowed, there's ATV access allowed in there. And it's not, I don't know what the regulations are around it. Maybe you can speak to it being a ranger before. But it seems to me like there's a lot of different ATV groups and stuff in that area that are creating trails and kind of out of their own money. There's some government grants going in, but not a lot. And they're creating trails and bridges and trying to be responsible, I guess. But I don't know what kind of regulation or enforcement there is to keep people on those trails and that kind of stuff. So, yeah. So I wonder, I know that's when I look online anyways, when people are worried about the new plan that is coming in place. I guess we didn't really say that there's a new plan coming. They're trying to create a new designation, right, for this area. Right. So.
Yeah. So that's all part of the regional planning for the entire North Saskatchewan region.
Right.
Where they're looking at not just the Bighorn, but everything within the area.
Yeah.
To see, and this is long term. This is looking out like 30, 50 years.
Of course.
Where this plan will.
Which you have to do for environmental management and forest management. Like that's the term. Yeah. Even 200-year horizons is necessary. Yeah.
Right. So the big thing with the recreation is that there's designated trails in the public land use zones.
Yeah.
So prior to this, in 2002, well, actually going back further, 1984, when the last policy for the Eastern Slopes came out, there was no OHV access permitted.
Right.
There was still some who went out there.
Right.
Actually, there was still quite a bit who went out there, but it wasn't technically like allowed.
It was illegal technically. Yeah.
Right. And so it was kind of a free-for-all Wild West sort of thing. The government recognized like, hey, we're starting to see some damage. We need to step in and really put something in place here.
And not just prohibit it, because that obviously didn't work. You need
Right.
to manage it and create trails that allow for responsible use of these vehicles. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And so that's what basically came out in the 2002 Bighorn Access Management Plan,
Mm-hmm.
where they sort of codified and formalized designated trails to try to minimize just people going everywhere.
Right.
To try to minimize the impact, to concentrate it more, to manage it essentially.
Yeah.
And that had, from what I've seen, had some degree of success.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is there's still a ton of unauthorized trails. There's still people out there making their own trails. There's still people doing their own thing.
Of course.
Enforcement is a big component of that.
Mm-hmm.
So enforcement officers get out there and they close down the trails. They fine people for going off them.
But there's not a lot of enforcement officers, my understanding is.
No.
Yeah.
For the size of the area, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the PLUZs cover probably like 6,100 square kilometers.
Oh, really?
And I think last summer we had 4 rangers out there.
Yeah, that's pretty tough, especially in that country, right? Like we're not talking about planes. We're talking about
right. You have to go out there on foot or on in a truck or on a quad and try to. And this is if people cooperate. We've had people run from us. We've had people. Like it can be a challenging circumstance. So enforcement is a crucial part of it, but it can't solve the problem.
No, of course not. No, absolutely not. So I wonder. So part of the problem I've seen from this isn't the only thing I want to talk about. I want to talk about everything, but the ATV thing is that's the biggest issue I see the public getting angry about. I've seen so many like Facebook groups and just people crying out about what's going to happen. I think because of this confusion, right? And they don't know what's going to happen. It's not, you know what I mean? Like the government hasn't decided what they're going to do yet. So, I think talking about a lot of them are talking about the lack of funding for these trails. They're saying a lot of these trails were made through these ATV groups that are in the area, but they're private. Most of it's privately funded with a little bit of grant money. And a lot of these groups, supposedly, I can't speak for them obviously, but they're saying they'd be okay with it becoming some kind of park as long as the ATV use was allowed. And that being said, they said that because they think that as soon as something becomes a park, all of a sudden it gets more funding. Right. And they're thinking that would allow for the proper bridges to be made to protect watersheds and the correct grading and all kinds of different stuff like that. I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're actually of the same mind in that right now it's having 6 public land use zones. There's a number of problems with it. One, there's a patchwork of different regulations and rules. And it's not always clear to people on the land base when you're going from one into the other.
Right.
Or it can be very intimidating for someone.
Big time. There's no signs out there. I mean, I've been out there. You spent a lot more time out there than I have, but I've spent quite a bit of time out there, and you just crest like a hill, like the upper foothills or the mountain, and all of a sudden you're in the other one. You're in the next one over, which has different restrictions. So there's no sign or line that you can know, and there's no cell phone service there either, so you can't find out. Yeah. So you have to know before you go out, and that can be confusing. And like I said, for the ones that don't allow ATV access right now, like personally, I think we should keep that way. Like we have to have some areas that are pristine wilderness in that way, right?
Right. And I think that most people can agree. Like, there are some areas that we just shouldn't have anything.
Yeah.
And in terms of the enforcement, give a good thing for that. If you do go out into the PLUZs there, you are supposed to have one of the paper copies of the public land use zones and the regulations. And you can pick them up in Rocky Mountain House, you can pick them up in Nordag. Yeah. But by law, you do have to have those when you're there.
So that's the map and the regs?
Yeah.
Basically?
So that, so you know where you're at, you know what the rules are.
Yep. Well, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
But if you're coming in, if you're a tourist, or if you don't know that, it can be hard to pick that up because there is a lack or a deficiency of signage for such a large area, and sometimes people don't know. Am I on a designated trail? Is this trail I just went off on unregulated or?
How are people supposed to know, right? Because they're not going to look any differently than the regulated trails, right? If it's a trail that was unregulated and someone's coming in for the first time and just going, you can't blame them.
It could be very confusing. Right? I could totally understand that.
Yeah.
And so coming back to it, one of the reasons that we're really supportive of a wildland park designation is because, one, yes, we firmly believe that it does bring in increased funding.
Yeah.
Because it goes from public land to a park, and
Right.
and there's different things behind the scenes and different mechanisms and different funding models that allow different sources of funding to be accessible.
Yeah.
At the same time, we think it's a huge, just in terms of the average user, because if, say, I was from out of province and I was like, oh, I want to go down to this. Well, am I going to a PLUZ? Which PLUZ is it? Am I going to the PLUZ? Is it a PLUZ?
Yeah.
Is it the David Thompson corridor? Is it the Bighorn backcountry? Like, what is it?
Wilderness areas.
There's no cohesive idea for the area right
It's
now.
confusing for
It
myself.
is.
Like I'm a forester, and I like literally went to school like looking at what a PLUZ is, what a wilderness area is, what a park is. Like I know that stuff, but even for myself, I look at it, I'm like, oh, what are the differences again? What's the regulations? Like how does that change?
Yeah.
So it's confusing, right? And yeah, I think anyways.
Yeah. And so I'm in CPAWS, and for us, we're firmly in the belief that having a park designation can help create a unified vision or idea for the area, both for tourism, recreation, and so people just know where it is.
Right.
I've heard a lot of criticism that people want to go hiking back there. It's like, well, there's no trail map. Like, sure, there's the David Thompson corridor map you can get from some outdoor stores and stuff.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are like, it's confusing. It's not really clear. It doesn't give me a good concept of what's out there.
It's a bad map. Yeah.
Yeah. Or it could be improved upon.
Yeah.
And again, with parks, you get that capacity to have properly mapped trails, to make it easier to find out where you want to go and not having to troll through forums that are 8 years old and find the post like, oh, there's a trail there. Cool.
Yeah.
And then, shoot, I'm losing my train of thought there.
That's okay. It happens. We got lots to talk about, but
Yeah,
we were talking about the ATV use and recreation and trying to turn it into a park to maybe increase funding so that we can manage that recreation a little bit better, but still allow it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is one thing. So there is a number of great groups that do a lot of work out there. There's the Friends of the Eastern Slope Association. There's the Bighorn Heritage ATV Society. There's the Clearwater Trails Initiative.
Yeah.
And these groups are all doing a lot of really great work with volunteers and not a lot of funding.
Yeah, they get private funding from the
Yeah.
volunteers. Yeah.
And so the work they're doing
Yeah.
in terms of making the trails more rider friendly, basically creating capacity for people to be able to enjoy the areas better.
Yeah.
We're fully supportive of that.
Yeah.
They have a 4-point plan that they put out there. Like, well, we don't need a park. We just need to follow this 4-point plan.
Right.
And the main concepts of it, and there's 4 big ones. One's increased enforcement. So we need more and better enforcement out there. We need better education.
Yeah.
So creating a better land ethic, teaching people hey, this is why it's not cool to go and tear through a wetland.
Yeah. I guess I should just quickly point that out. I guess some people might not understand what's the problem with ATVs on a landscape that's sensitive like the headwaters. And I guess the main thing is ATVs and vehicles tend to rip up the soil, and they create erosion into the water. And if an ATV goes through a river or whatever, there's all kinds of sediment that falls off into that. Could be some grease or oil or whatever, and all that could end up in the water, which ends up you end up not drinking, but it ends up down the line. It keeps going there. So yeah, that's kind of the main issue. Anyways, keep going about it.
Although I'd almost love to continue down that,
sure,
because there's a lot of things with that, and there's some misconception with that.
Right.
So from our we've had some criticism where people are our sort of campaign is love your headwaters, and that we need to protect our headwaters.
Yeah.
And
people see that as a stay out of the headwaters completely, and that's not what it is.
Which is not what we're trying to get at.
No.
And it's also not that it's not dirty. It's not like there's a bunch of sewage coming out and floating down the river. The river is clean up in the headwaters.
You're just trying to keep it that way.
Right. We're trying to keep it clean. And also we're trying to keep it there. Some of the big concerns we have is that not that it the quality of the water, but the actual availability of the water. So a lot of the climate models, a lot of the basically science and a lot of the data that we've seen are indicating that area is going to be getting cooler, wetter winters. Great. But drier and warmer end of summer, early autumn.
Yeah.
And as anybody who's lived in Alberta, that's generally the worst of our fire season.
Mm-hmm.
And Albertans are very aware of the devastation that can be caused by fires.
Yep.
Like, what was it? Slave
Lake.
Slave Lake and Fort McMurray,
Mm-hmm.
both within the last decade.
Yep.
So with these conditions, from everything we can tell, are trending towards that. That means not so much that the water will have roughly the same amount of water, but it's when that water is available.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's something that people misunderstand, is that the water's always there, but the precip changes all the time, right? And it's spots like that where the water's, it's a collection basin, right? That's where the water's being collected. If there's no precipitation, then there's less flow, right? And there's all kinds of anyways.
And that can impact agriculture. That impacts everybody. Fishing, recreation, everybody.
Yeah. Same as having too much precipitation all of a sudden, as we can say for Calgary flooding, right?
Right.
So
that's one of the issues, is that when you get large landscape changes, you get soil compaction from quad trails. You get decrease in vegetation. So on trails, generally the vegetation on the sides of the trail gets diminished.
Yep.
So when that soil gets compacted, it doesn't absorb water.
Mm-hmm.
Or it absorbs it increasingly less well.
Mm-hmm.
Which means more of that water is going directly into the river.
Yeah.
And people are like, well, you're still getting the same amount of water, but that water is going in faster. It's not being released over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that causes concerns that, sure, if all that water comes down, the land isn't retaining it. So when you get into those drier seasons, there's no water to be let loose from the land. There's no water to be melted from the glacier.
Yep.
And that's where you're getting into this water availability thing.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not necessarily like we're not so worried that people are emptying their gas tanks into the river, or like puncturing their batteries and throwing them in. Like that's not what we're trying to get.
I don't know about you, but that's what I do when I'm ATVing.
So a lot of people will point like, look, the water is so clean and healthy. And it's like, yes, but that's only matters if you still have water there.
Yeah. Well, then there's a huge part about, like you were saying, about instead of the water being absorbed by the soil and slowly making its way down through the water table into the river. That's the normal way of it going through, with a little bit of runoff, but not. I went to a good talk. I forget what her name was. I wish I had a better memory, but she gave a whole conversation about the importance of intact forest and intact vegetation for cleaning our water and reducing that stress on our water cleaning facilities, and saying it was amazing, the numbers that she was saying, right? Like the filter capabilities of like 500 meters of forest drastically like reduce. I don't remember the exact numbers, but drastically reduces the cost of filtration down the line, right?
Right.
And as soon as you have like a quad trail or something like that, then you don't have that slow release, right? So it doesn't get cleaned. It just kind of ends up probably picking up sediment, and then that ends up in the river, which is, anyways.
Yeah.
But there's responsible ways to allow ATV and OHV use on the landscape. Yeah.
And this is what we're getting at. And like I said, going back to their 4 big points, enforcement, more enforcement. But one of them is the scientific and the engineering capacity of it. So when you actually create designated trails, those trails are built to certain standards. They're built to withstand the amount of traffic going on. They're built to not increase that runoff and to minimize the impact.
Yeah.
When you start getting people going off making their own trails, the areas they're going into could be entirely unsuited. It might take 10 years. It might take 50 years for that area to recover.
Or more longer. Like some of I know even with equestrian use, like I ride horseback in the Blackstone Wappi Abbey with my uncle and stuff like that periodically, and that even with their trails, like even just with the horses, you can see there's 30 to 50 centimeters of soil compaction, right? And that's just because it's that landscape is not used to that kind of compaction, right? So I can imagine with quads on it all the time, it can definitely take a long time. Like I would argue probably hundreds of years to come back. Yeah. Right. So, and
especially like when you start getting up more into your foothills and your mountain ecosystems, the resiliency of those systems, it takes a lot longer. The soils are a lot thinner. Mm-hmm. There's just not as much capacity for it to rebound from an impact.
Yeah.
And I mean, some people might say like, well, why are you picking on OHVs? Like horses cause compaction, hikers cause compaction. Mm-hmm. So why OHVs? And a big part of that is the scale of the extent. So you can go a lot farther in one day with an OHV than you can hiking or skiing or horseback riding generally. And
the potential for damage is a lot more too, because if you get stuck in a mud hole and you just pin it, right, and you just throw the throttle down and start whipping out mud all over the place. Like it's easier to cause damage, basically.
Right.
If you don't know what you're doing. Yeah.
And a vast majority of people are good. They know not to do certain things, but there's still a sizable portion of people that don't.
Yeah.
And that comes down into that education component, is that we need to educate people on how to do these things properly and why it's important to do that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. A lot of those, that's one of the main reasons that I'm pro ATV and OHV and recreation use in all these areas, right? Is that I think some organizations get kind of carried away, not CPAWS, but some are get carried away in thinking that if we can remove access to these areas, then we will protect them for generations. And you know what I mean? But the problem with that is that if you remove access, then people stop going, people stop caring.
Yeah.
Right? As soon as people stop caring, then it starts getting, you know what I mean, taken advantage of and exploited. So personally, I'm for anything that will allow people to get out into the mountains and into the bush and enjoy it, whether it's hunting or fishing or hiking or camping, or as long as it's responsible, and it can all be done responsibly, right? And that's exactly. That's the main point here. And I think so with this wildland park that you guys are proposing or whatever, so the intent is to allow ATV and OHV use and hunting and fishing and all that kind of stuff, or is that the details still being hashed out?
So for our perspective,
like
hunting and fishing are allowed.
Yeah.
That's straight up, as well as pretty much all the current non-motorized uses.
Right.
We're fully supporting. In terms of OHV use, our personal position is we'd like to see it not in there, but we're also willing to work with people to make sure that if it is in there, that is done right. And I mean, ultimately, it's not our decision.
No, you guys are not. You guys are a campaigning organization. I think that's important to point out, is that I think people will blame campaigns like CPAWS or Y2Y for all of their whatever is happening, right? But it's like, ultimately, let's remember that the government's making these decisions, and it's their responsibility to make sure that they do public outreach and all that kind of stuff, right? So, yeah, for sure.
So we're basically giving the opinion of, because we're Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, like that's not having motorized access in there would be great, but we're also very cognizant of the fact that there's a long history of OHV use in Alberta, that there's a long history of use in that area, that there has been some really great stewardship and management by some of these groups out there, and a lot of volunteer time and of their own funding put in.
Yeah.
So to just like wipe all of that away, we can we're fully cognizant that there's a lot of value in there.
Yeah.
And so we're willing to be like, hey, okay, if you had to choose, where are your highest value recreation? Like, where do you most love to use OHVs in the Bighorn?
Yeah.
Great. We come up. These are where we see are the most sensitive areas and the areas that are least able to handle that impact.
Yeah.
Great. Now we have these two things. Where can we see going forward? What's the best way to go forward with this?
Yeah. That's kind of what I think as well. I think that there might be areas currently that maybe should be restricted access, you know what I mean? Like, or something like that, or no access. But personally, I feel like there should still be allowed access, because I think there's a lot of people in that Calgary, Red Deer, Rocky Mountain House area that they've historically, that's where they've done this kind of usage, right?
Yeah.
And I would like to continue to see them be able to do that kind of stuff, as long as it's done, like we said, like we keep saying ad nauseum, responsibly, right? So I feel like making it a park might actually provide that opportunity to do that kind of stuff. So that because of the funding, because of all of a sudden we can enforcement and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting.
Oh, and that's one of the big things is, like, if you have a park, you have certainty.
Yeah.
There's a degree of certainty. And certainty leads to investment.
Yeah.
Investors like to have a degree of certainty that, hey, if I put something here, it's not just going to be taken away.
Right.
And whether that's a business, whether that's a OHV club that wants to put a bridge in.
Yeah.
Because right now, no one wants to do anything because they're afraid, well, it's all just going to get wiped away.
Yeah.
So having a park there actually is beneficial, because there's been proposals for a park for decades.
Yeah.
And there's good reasoning behind why it's we're advocating to have one there.
Yeah. People see park and they immediately think, oh my God, we're not allowed to go hunting. We're not allowed to go fishing. We're not allowed to go hiking or random camping or all this stuff, right? And that's not what we're proposing here. It's something else entirely.
Yeah. And a lot of people will point to the castle. because that's the most immediate example, and a lot of people were disappointed with the results.
So the Castle Mountain area, just for people that know, it's just south of the Bighorn, a few hundred kilometers, and it's a different recreational area. I don't even know 100% what happened there. What was kind of
Right. So it was another area where there was a lot of OHV use. The Castle Park a provincial park was put in, the Castle Wildland Park was put in.
Okay.
The provincial park being a bit more restrictive, the Wildland Park being a bit less restrictive.
Okay.
But covering a larger area.
Yeah.
And basically that was because there was sort of the extent of the impact from OHV use was deemed to be too high for the area.
Yeah. I've been in some of those public land use zones, like the Burnt Timber public land use zone a few years back. And I was there on a long weekend, and I was blown away by the amount of, like, I like the idea of random camping. Like, I understand what people say by random camping. I mean, I just want to be able to go out and camp in the wilderness. And I'm like, I'm all for that. But if you're going out with your mudded up Jeep and your fifth wheel and you're tearing the whole place up to try and get your fifth wheel into this random camping spot, I have a problem with that, right? I feel like, and people leave garbage, and they, not everybody, like we said, it's the 10-15% that ruin it for the rest of us, right? And
exactly.
I don't think we're blaming everybody. We're blaming that 10 or 15% that suck.
But unfortunately, we still need to, like, we don't want to punish everybody, but at the same time, you can't just let that keep happening.
It needs to be regulated. We need to make sure that those areas are around for generations, right? Like, I remember being in the Burnt Timber area, and it was beautiful. It's a beautiful spot, but I don't remember seeing an animal anywhere. And there was a lot of use, right? From everywhere, from recreation to industry to everything. It's a confusing situation, because you want to allow recreation, you want to allow people to enjoy themselves, you want to allow people to pass on those values to their kids and stuff. But at the same time, we need to make sure those values can exist in the future.
We don't want to degrade those values. We don't want to have our kids or our kids' kids go out there and be like, wow, this place is, like, ruined.
Yeah.
And it's great. Like, for OHVs, I've heard from lots of people who are like, hey, I'm disabled, or I'm really old. Mm-hmm. Like, the only way I'm getting out to the back is on a motorized vehicle.
Yeah.
And so for some people, an OHV is the only way they can really get out and enjoy that backcountry.
Yeah.
Like, not everybody has 5 days they can take off to go hiking into this beautiful area.
What's the thing? To get into the back of some of those areas, if you can't use a horse or a quad or something, then it's literally going to take you days and days and days to get back there. And it's an interesting concept, because I thought about that a while back. Like, I wonder if I would be okay with the idea of an area that could be perfectly pristine and perfectly wilderness and natural, with quotations, right? And not be allowed to go in there. And I was like, it's an interesting thought experiment, because it's like, I would cherish the thought of knowing that exists, but also the reality is that it wouldn't exist for long, because it would, you know what I mean? Like, what's the point of having it for, people want value somehow, right? And just the knowledge of knowing it's there is not value enough, I think. So it's interesting that it's just such a crazy situation to try and wrap your head around how much recreation to allow, where the restrictions lie, what are the, you know what I mean? All that kind of stuff. Like, it's a fascinating issue, and I don't have the answers, but that's why we're here talking about it. So
exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is what I've, again, talked to a lot of people, and it was really interesting, because in the end, we agree on like 90 to 95% of the things we want for the area. Mm-hmm. We want to have a great, like, wilderness backyard. We want to be able to take our kids out there and have a good time. Mm-hmm. We want to have a good, clean environment. Like, these are all things all of us can agree on.
Yeah.
And it really comes down to that 5-10% of things that we're kind of like quibbling over, where it's like, well, we want all this, but we want to have OHVs. Well, we want to have all this, but not have OHVs.
Yeah.
And that's like one tiny component of this
giant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I really, it's frustrating where everybody's so polarized, focusing on these little things we disagree on, whereas we can't come together and agree, like, on these 95% of things that we're all for.
Everyone stands their ground egotistically and doesn't want to see the other person's side because they feel they're being attacked, right? And I agree with you. Like, I would love to have integrated management where we have all of these users coming together to try to understand each other and to come up with a solution that's creative and integrative, right? Because right now, I think a lot of people do just stand their ground angrily and point their finger. And as soon as you start yelling at somebody and pointing your finger, they're not listening anymore.
Yeah.
They're just protecting their own ego at that point, and you're not going to get through, right? So it's a fascinating situation, and very interesting.
Well, that's the hope, is that we can bring these groups, like all of our groups together, whether it's environmental non-government organizations or outdoor recreationists and government. Yeah. Because really, we can have all the say any of our groups. Yeah. But in the end, it's the government that has the deciding factor on what actually happens with the land. But I think if we can actually bring ourselves together and agree that we're not going to agree on everything. We're going to have to both, everybody has to make a bit of compromise. Yeah. But in the end, we can make a stronger product than if either side just holds his ground and says, no, never. Yeah. We're not going to get anywhere. Yeah, no, for sure. No, and everybody will lose. Yeah, so exactly. So as far as industry, kind of going back to the industry side of things, my understanding, looking through maps and kind of being back there a little bit, there's not a lot of industry activity in the public land use zones right now. There is some, some well sites, and there is some logging being done, but not a lot. It's very minimal, right? So the idea there is to kind of stop that. Right. In the proposed park area, which is majority, I think 80% of it is in the public land use zones, correct? 80% of it. Yeah. Right, because we don't feel that extractive industry is appropriate for that land base. And again, that's one of those things where a lot of recreationists agree with us on that. I would agree with that, because it's an area that we have lots of forest tenure in Alberta. Yeah. So, and as far as oil and gas, I don't know. I have no experience with oil and gas. I can't speak to it. I can, you know what I mean? So I'll stay away from that. But yeah, there's lots of forest tenure in Alberta. I think I would appreciate having that area being, like we said, untouched in industry kind of way, right? Yeah. I noticed that some of the park included some of the adjacent forest management areas where there is forest tenure. What was the reasoning behind that? Right. So we've done a lot of us and other organizations have done a lot of modeling of various attributes. Yeah. So whether that included endangered species or sensitive areas or a large quantity of different both landscape and biological criteria. Yeah. And we determined that the best, if we were to maximize the value of this park, that including some of that area outside of the current public land use zones would create the best value. Okay. So that's a tough one though, because if you try to, I can't speak for those mills and stuff that have the tenure in there, but I imagine there's a lot of community values in there as well, and it's going to be it's tough, because now you start, instead of just dealing with public and government, now you're dealing with public, government, and industry. Right. And it's industry that currently has a stake in that timber, right? So or whatever those resources are. So I imagine that's got to be a difficult. You got to really prove that that's the right move, and that's the right move for a lot of different reasons, right? Right. And from what we've looked into, and we've done cost benefits and all these sorts of things, that there's not a lot of lost economic opportunity from including those areas. Because if there was, it doesn't make sense. When we do these analyses, yes, we take into account landscape, we take into account biology factors, but we also took into account the economic value of those areas. Okay. And if it was vastly high, then we're cool, we'll leave that area out, but maybe we can include the next best we can get. Because we recognize that nothing happens in a vacuum, that economic activity is important. You don't have anything without economic activity. You need money, otherwise, people tend not to do stuff without money. Exactly. In terms of jobs, just in terms of running the economy, paying for Alberta Environment and Parks that runs the parks. They're all of it's tied together. Yeah. So all the population studies and stuff done for hunting and fishing regulations and all that. That's all comes from taxing hunting and fishing tags and stuff, right? So all that kind of stuff comes from monetizing the value somehow. Exactly. Yeah. And so one of the great reasons for proposing for a Bighorn Wildland Park is that, one, there's very little industry there already. Right. That the area we're including outside of it where there is industry, it's not a large portion of it, and it's not exceptionally economically valuable. Okay. There is economic value to it. Yeah. But that's something that you can work with.
I'd be interested to see how that goes. I don't know. I'm not going to speak to it or make recommendations or anything because I know nothing about that area whatsoever.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting. The other major one was these proposed coal mines.
Yes.
That's an interesting one. Where are those supposed to end up being? Because generally, coal seams you end up finding close to rivers, close to water bodies and stuff. Yeah, where are those in the proposed park or outside?
So it's interesting. So that is one of our big concerns is that if coal is extensively developed in the area, that it will be detrimental to the environmental.
That's an open pit situation, right? Like it's an open pit mine, or do you have any idea how they're planning on extracting that? It's not like an underground deal, or
I believe it's underground. I'm not 100% sure. I know
okay.
I've looked at their actual document.
Okay.
Because they are fairly far into the planning process for this.
Yep. I haven't, so I know nothing. I'm asking questions here.
Right. But we do know that a small portion of the mine site is within our proposed boundary.
Okay.
And we've taken that into account in our economic analysis.
Okay.
So
it's a weird one because it sounds like all that. It's weird looking at Alberta and BC trying to shut down coal use, right? However, we are exporting all of it. Like we're doing a lot of it. We're doing a lot of mining for coal and exporting it all to China, it seems like. Right? So it's interesting that we have policy, and I understand what's going on there, right? China is a developing country that requires this to become developed and to meet our standards of living, right? So we can't say no to them, and I understand that. But yeah, it's interesting that this coal mine is it's not there yet, but it's being proposed and it looks like it's going to go through. So I'm just trying to get the feelers on that one.
Some of this will come down to, because I believe there is a review of Alberta's coal policies, essentially.
Yeah.
And so we can only do so much until that's actually announced and we know what impact that will have on these sorts of developments.
Okay.
But given from what we know and from current policy, yeah, obviously we wouldn't want that in the park. Yeah. But thankfully it is fairly minimally, like I said, only a small portion of it falls within the boundary.
Gotcha.
And like this is our ideal boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see. Yeah, because that's just your proposal. That's not
right. Like this is not like we're gonna die on this boundary line. Yeah. Like everything's compromised and give and take. But we're saying like this, from everything that we have, this is the ideal thing. Mm-hmm. Now let's work from this.
Right. So chances are it's going to end up getting smaller, and there's going to be lots of compromises. And obviously, the government has the final say. If they want to do what they want, they'll do what they want.
Exactly. But we're basically offering a base case like this is the ideal park. If you took out everything else, having no OHV is awesome. Having no coal mines or any industry, great. Yes. Now, working from that, what's the OHV value? Well, you want designated trails. Cool. Okay. How do we make that happen while still having the greatest value of this original? Yeah. And then you work together and you find compromises. It's like, well, we want to ride our OHVs everywhere. It's like, well, we want to have a park everywhere. So where is that?
There needs to be compromise.
Exactly.
Yeah. What's that from? It's a quote from Game of Thrones, I think. It's like, a good deal is one that leaves both sides upset.
Exactly. And that's probably what's going to end up happening. But that's the sign of a good compromise.
Yeah, exactly. No, for sure.
But I mean, that's what we want to drive home is like, yes, this is what we want, but we're pragmatic people. We're not just blindly pushing an idea. Mm-hmm. We have reasoning behind why we're suggesting this. Yeah. But there's economics, there's recreation, there's local considerations. So.
Yeah, cool. One of the things that actually Tara sent me in the email there was the Regional Advisory Council report. Yes. I didn't even know that existed. I didn't even know what the Regional Advisory Council is. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about that. What that is, what the purpose was, who's involved, because that's a really interesting and exciting opportunity there.
Yeah. So this is a really big thing. Basically, the Regional Advisory Council, I think it's a group of 24 people. Mm-hmm.
24, 25.
Give or take. It's a mid-20s-ish number of people from across basically the North Saskatchewan watershed. Right. Which is what the North Saskatchewan Regional Plan covers. Yeah. So this is basically how Alberta is approaching its land management for the entire province for the next 30 to 50 years. Right. So the Regional Advisory Council was brought together, people from all different backgrounds, ranchers and industry and...
Yeah, I've got it written down, actually. There's farmers, ranchers, there's politicians, there's professors, there's oil and gas, there's utility, biologists, First Nations groups, foresters, ecotourism. Like, they basically covered the whole gamut of things going on the watershed.
Exactly. They wanted to get the government wanted to get a great cross-section of different expertise and different backgrounds to give... advice to the government on how they should proceed with developing this plan.
So is this a government? It's not a government council, right? Like, it's just it was government supported council.
Yeah, it was convened by the government, so
Right.
The government gave the mandate for them.
Gotcha.
And I believe there was one government representative as the chair of it.
Right.
But everything else was, they had the independence to. They were provided a terms of reference.
Right.
So the government was like, "This is what exists here right now.
Mm-hmm.
This is how we see it. What's your input? How do you see it? What's the best way to move forward on this?"
Cool.
So
what's the purpose? Yeah, let's talk
right.
about it.
So that was convened in 2014. It just got their final recommendations from the Regional Advisory Council got released, I think, the end of March.
Okay.
And they have a 60-day commenting period by the public to give comments on what this council, this group of people, of experts, has provided and is providing to the government.
Right. So I've seen it actually. There's what do you call it? There's like a quiz, not a quiz.
Survey.
Yeah. There's
A
survey.
feedback form, kind of.
There's a feedback form, a survey going around that if anybody interested listening wants to go on, they can go on to that and they can answer the questions, and that'll help advise the Regional Advisory Council, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the government is taking every one of these feedback forms that's filled out and taking that feedback into consideration. Then it goes through they come up with a draft plan based upon all that advice.
Yeah.
The public is again invited to provide comments on that.
Yeah.
Then they produce a final plan.
I've looked at it, and it's actually interesting. It's not like most government surveys where you get a question and they say yes or no, and the question is super like middle of the line. Like, it doesn't, you know what I mean? No matter what you answer, you're kind of agreeing with it.
Right.
Whereas this form, from what I looked at it, it's short answer. So you literally write down what you want. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's not like a agree, disagree sort of thing. This is the recommendations the Regional Advisory Council has provided.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
this?
and that's awesome.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of money and work to sort all that out, but I'm glad they're doing it that way.
Yeah. One of the things is that it is quite technical.
Mm-hmm.
The Regional Advisory Council's report is, I think, about 86 pages of like fairly technical
I
documentation.
think it was 90 something. But there was also it was a lot. Anyways, it's a lot. It's a hell of a report. Very very thorough. I tried skimming through it, and there's a lot going on in there. So
So it can be a bit intimidating and or overwhelming for I guess sort of your average Albertan to really dig into it without a fair bit of time investment to really get a good grasp of all the background information that's being presented.
Yeah.
At the same time, I know there's a number of organizations like our organization has also released like, this is how we've gone through it. We've really dug into it. And this is the opinion of our organization.
Yeah.
And then I know some of the OHV communities that are like, we've gone through it and this is our recommendations on it.
Yeah.
So there are some of those floating out there that if people feel really strongly for any of these organizations, that can help inform their answers.
Yep.
But you can absolutely just kind of dig into it yourself. But it's essentially, if you want to have a say in it, it's really important to fill out the survey.
Yeah.
And it's open until May 4th. After that point, they cut it off, and then they take all that advice in. But I would recommend anybody who cares about the land management, whether it's wetlands, whether it's lakes, whether it's parks, recreation, look through the survey, get involved, because it's worthwhile, because this is...
I'm going to say that in the intro, just so, because a lot of people don't make it this far into the podcast, but I'll say that in the intro so everybody gets it. So the Regional Advisory Council, so a bunch of different professionals and stakeholders that are coming together to try and, I'm guessing that they sit down and they discuss all of these topics and come up with a agreement for a draft plan, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anything that was presented in their report, they had to have at least 75% consensus from the committee to include it.
That's awesome.
And they break it all down. They say, these are what was provided for us by the government. These are the things we agreed with. Here are some things that they didn't suggest that we think they should consider.
Yeah.
So it is a fairly informed document.
Awesome. That's good. So is this kind of the beginning of the consultation process for the government?
Pretty much. This is sort of like the kickoff.
So it's just starting. Because I know a lot of people have been upset that they haven't been consulted and that stuff's happening, but I think there's confusion there that there's really no decisions have been made yet. The consultation process is still beginning.
This is still fairly in its, I wouldn't say infancy, because it has gone through...
it's its teenage years.
Yeah. It's growing up.
Yeah.
And so this is the first stage where the public gets input into it.
Yeah.
But it's not the last one.
Right.
There's more, it's more iterative.
So there's lots of time for anybody that has opinions to get their opinions heard still.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you want to have that initial say and get that initial input to the government, this is the time.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So I think that was some of the concern, is that the consultation was over already or something, right? But no, it's just starting. So
it's really just starting.
Okay. Awesome. Cool. I think that's, now that I'm looking at my questions, I think that's pretty much covers everything that I wanted to kind of get to. Is so your guys' recommendations was to create this wildland provincial park. That's what you're calling it, right? Wildland provincial park, allow hunting and fishing in its current, the way it is, right? And then, hiking, some equestrian use, and preferably you guys don't want ATV and OHV access, but that's just your, like I said, you guys don't have any power in this. It's besides talking to people.
And we're totally supportive of that if there is.
Mm-hmm. Being an environmental and park and recreation association, like that's what your guys' deal is. You're trying to do that. That's your mandate, right? So then you have to talk to all the other organizations, all the other associations, and come up with a compromise, like you said. So yeah. Awesome. Do you have any final thoughts? I mean, we don't have to end it right away. That's kind of the stuff that I got through. So feel free to keep talking if there's something you want to discuss.
Yeah. I guess the biggest one, because there's our stance on it.
Yeah.
And then there's like the sort of legislative and government stance on these differences.
Yeah.
So if you take a public land use zone and a wildland park.
Yeah.
Legislatively, neither one allows OHV use. As a baseline, public land use zones don't allow quad use or OHV use.
That's the baseline, but then
they look at the area, they consider the local conditions, they consider the terrain, then they're like, all right, we've looked at it, we're going to allow access here, we're going to allow access here, but we're going to keep restricted access here.
Yeah.
So the fact that a park is going in doesn't mean that it eliminates any possibility. It's not closing off, not putting a gate around it.
Mm-hmm.
Same as a lot of people are worried about random camping disappearing.
Yeah.
And one of the things is that I think a lot of people can agree there are some areas that are fairly degraded from random camping. One of the great examples is along Abraham Lake, right along Highway 11 there, where people have just pulled off everywhere, and it's really starting to show.
Yeah.
And
that's with by random camping, you're talking about like RVs and stuff, not just like somebody setting up a tent.
Yeah. A lot of like essentially the largest impacts are when people are pulling in large vehicles to these areas
leaving
repeatedly
garbage.
over time, leaving garbage, having unregulated fire pits, which we've had issues with.
Starting wildfires, like that's,
Yeah. And as a former park ranger, we did run into that on a number of occasions, even when the fire risk was extremely high.
Yeah.
And not that it's bad. Again, I random camped. I enjoy it. I don't want to see it disappear either. But we need to be smart about where we allow it.
Sorry, that was, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but that was one thing that I saw some people were upset about. They were taking these areas where there was random camping and paving them, and people are upset because they made it not natural, right? And it's like, well, the idea there, I'm guessing, is to reduce runoff and waste and to make it more environmentally friendly and maintainable, right? Whereas if we just have soft ground there, then every time it rains and people are driving in there and it causes all kinds of rutting and problems. And so I feel like paving something like that or opening up an area, designated area for camping is the right way to go about it, to concentrate that use, right?
Right. Yeah. But it doesn't even mean we have to like eliminate random camping. We just need to look at the areas where it's like, yes, you can random camp here because it's the soils are more resilient, so they can rebound. Yeah. But here they're really thin. If you random camp here, they're never going to regenerate.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of picking in the areas as opposed to having you can camp anywhere, being like, well, you can random camp over here, you can random camp over there. And they don't necessarily have to be these campsites.
Yeah.
These like you're 4 feet away from your neighbor and you have to be quiet by 11.
Yeah.
That's
the idea of random camping is you're in the bush. You can do what you want. Like
exactly. It could be close to a fishing spot you want to be at. It could be
Yeah.
close to a staging ground that you want to be at. But it's taking that and again, managing it, because if you don't manage it, it degrades, and we all want to be able to enjoy this moving forward, and we want our kids to be able to enjoy it.
Yeah.
And if you don't manage it, it's just going to get worse.
Yeah, no, we don't want the Wild West out there, right? Like, I agree. Like, I love random camping, but like, it's also, you have to do it respectively, right? And there needs to be some kind of regulation around it. Unfortunately, it may mean that there's a size restriction on the camper you're allowed to random camp with, right? Like, you got a 45-foot trailer. Like, maybe that's not random camping. Like, maybe that's supposed to be in an RV lot, right? Like, that's the point of that. If you want to random camp, you need to have under a certain size, maybe.
Yeah. Or hey, if this is farther back, you can only random camp with this kind of a unit. Yeah. Whereas if you're in this area, sure, it's already really disturbed. Yeah, you can random camp with these larger ones. Yeah. And just having a bit more perspective about what impact you're having on them.
And that's the thing. I think people they get confused. Like, well, it's not random camping if I can't just do what I want. And it's like, well, you have to understand there's other values at play, right? Like they feel like that the government is stepping on their freedom a bit, being like, well, this is my land. Like, I can do what I want. And you're like, well, there's something that I try to say, try to explain to people is that, yeah, it is your land. # your forest. I'm just kidding. But it's also everybody else's as well. Right. So you can't do whatever you want because someone else might not want you doing that. So it's everyone's land, not just yours, right? Like it requires that. So because of that, it requires somebody to manage it, some group to understand everybody's utility and everybody's values and to try and come up with a best case solution for everything. So I just hope that people can see, the different users can see that that's the case, that they're not people aren't trying to step on your freedoms. That's not what's happening. They're trying to make sure that you can continue to do those types of things. And yeah, that might mean that your use might have to change a bit, but that's the result of us being on the landscape, right? We tend to have a pretty big footprint on whatever we touch. So we have to make sure that whatever that footprint is, we're understanding the implications of that.
And let's make it the best all around. Like if we're going to have trails, let's make them the best darn trails that we have.
100%, yeah.
Let's get funding for them, good enforcement, good engineering, and yeah, let's have awesome trails. Yeah. If we want to have a good hiking trail, go full in on it. Yeah. But if you allow stuff everywhere, you lose focus. You can't put a bridge over every crossing when you can go anywhere. Yeah. And you might end up creating a situation where the land is so degraded over time that sure your children and your grandchildren are allowed to go out there and do that, but it's not the same landscape that you were there because you guys ruined it or whatever, right? Like it's Well, and this is one of the big things is that people are like, it's been fine for all these years. Like, why change it? And I've heard this from everything from working in forestry for people not wanting safety gear. Because I haven't worn safety gear in 30 years. Why should I start wearing it now? And it's like, well, because people have died doing it. You might not have yet. Yeah. But you have to wear safety glasses now. Well, because a lot of people have lost their eyes because of doing this dangerous activity. Yeah. So just because it's been great for 30 years doesn't mean that it's been great for everybody. Yeah. And so when you're looking at land management, yes, it might have been great for you and the values that you care about for over the last 30 years, but it doesn't mean that the land hasn't been changing and that it hasn't been getting worse for other people who might enjoy certain things out there. For sure. And especially the population of Alberta is doubled in the last 30, 40 years. More people are getting out into the backcountry. You want to let them do that, right? We want to be proactive. We don't want to let all this happen and then 20 years down the road be like, oh, maybe we should start managing it because it's getting out of hand. Well,
that's the thing. For example, with the caribou issue, right? Like it's one of those things where I feel like we should be focusing on stuff that has not yet been degraded to the point that it's causing problems. You focus on the stuff that's still manageable rather than taking this, you got to take kind of a triage approach to it, unfortunately, right? So for example, the Bighorn backcountry is more or less untouched. So if we start now, there won't be a whole lot of changes that have to be made because we can kind of leave it more or less as is with some changes. Whereas some place that maybe had full industrial use and full recreational use and is totally a different landscape now, it's harder to try and get that back to natural, right?
If you can even get it back to natural.
If you can, because the footprint is so big, right? So I agree. Like if something is already good, like let's try to leave it that way. And that might mean that we needed to change, 10 or 15% of what's going on to try and protect it and keep it that way for future generations. It's just such a big problem for people to understand. And like we said, there's so many people out there that have those values and care about those places, but they can't spend their time researching this and understanding everything. Like you can't expect them to do that. That's exhausting. And who has time for that?
People have their lives.
They have jobs and kids and other interests and like other, you know what I mean? So it's hopefully with, the media and the podcast and stuff like this, that we can get that information out there and people we can come together as a group and talk. And even though we have different perspectives, we might be able to understand each other and come to a compromise, like you said, right?
And for me, like I was trained as a forester.
Yeah.
And we were taught to look at 100-year timeframes, 150-year timeframes.
Here's 200.
200-year timeframes.
Yeah.
So it's trying to take like everything I approach, especially with the Bighorn here. I'm trying to look, what's this going to be like 100 years down the road?
Big time.
Is it going to be what we want it to be?
Yeah.
And if not, how do we get there?
Yeah.
And the more people we can bring into that conversation and get input from and have everybody understand like that kind of a time scale, I think the better result we're going to get. And the more that the future generations are going to appreciate the work that we put in, whether it's the work that CPAWS is doing, whether it's the work that the government is doing or recreationists, whether like 30 years from now, like these are the best trails in Canada.
Yeah.
We help make that happen.
Right.
Like let's get together. Let's do it, because right now with the polarization and I just see everybody is gonna lose on it.
Everyone's pointing fingers. Everyone's getting angry. Everyone's standing their ground. And guess what? If everyone's standing their ground, nothing gets done.
Yeah. And if nothing changes, and this is what I worry, if nothing changes, what are we going to be left with?
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, this is awesome. I think we had a really comprehensive discussion about this. I think people will get a lot out of this. So thanks a lot for coming on. This was perfect.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
If anyone wants to reach out to you, they can just shoot me an email at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com and I can get the email out. And then I'm going to post this on a few different Facebook groups that I know will have this kind of concern. And another thing is the rack. Is there any other, like you guys have social media and stuff like that where people can keep up to date on what CPAWS is doing, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so Instagram,
Facebook, and Twitter.
Okay, so there you go. So thanks a lot for listening, guys, and we'll thanks for coming on, man.
Right, thank you.
Thanks for listening, guys. If you want to reach out to me, like I said, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com. You can check out Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. It's all on there. Follow me. Yeah, I can help me get the message out there. And if you're on iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher, I think you can, for sure on iTunes anyways, you can rate, review, and like leave comments underneath. I really, really appreciate it. It helps me out a whole lot. So thanks a lot for listening, guys, and we'll see you next time.